Chapter 30, American Life in the Roaring Twenties. The Republican Old Guard returns. Republican Warren G. Harding becomes president in 1921. In the early years of the 1920s, the Supreme Court started dismantling progressive legislation. They declared a federal child labor law unconstitutional. They took away labor gains, and they restricted government intervention in the economy. Adkins v. Children's Hospital reversed the Supreme Court ruling in Muller v. Oregon, which said that women had weaker bodies, so they needed special protection in the workplace. This was the idea that they shouldn't have to work as many hours as men because of their weaker bodies. The Supreme Court reasoned with Adkins, Adkins v. Children's Hospital, that since women now had the right to vote, they were the legal equals of men and could not continue to be protected by special legislation. The aftermath of war. The restrictive measures that were enacted during World War I to regulate the economy and ensure that resources were being most efficiently used were dismantled after the war. The War Industries Board was dismantled, and progressive hopes for more government regulation of big business disappeared. The federal government returned the railroads to private management in 1920. Many reformers hoped that wartime government railroad operations would lead to the nationalization of the railroads. Congress encouraged private consolidation of the railroads. Veterans benefited from the war. In 1921, Congress created the Veterans Bureau. They had the power to operate hospitals and provide vocational rehabilitation for disabled vets. Veterans began calling for adjusted compensation. They wanted adjusted compensation for the money they lost on their factory jobs when they went to serve in the war. In 1924, Congress passed the Adjusted Compensation Act. It gave former soldiers a paid-up insurance policy that was due in 20 years. Section 30.19, the stench of scandal. Several scandals plagued Harding's presidency. The first scandal involves Charles Forbes. Charles Forbes, Forbes, was head of the Veterans Bureau, and he stole about $200 million. Largely, he was supposed to be building a veterans hospital, or veterans hospitals, and he was sentenced to 2 years in the penitentiary for failing to build the hospitals and steal the money. The Teapot Dome scandal. The Teapot Dome scandal is a scandal that involves the illegal leasing of priceless naval oil reserves in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California. President Harding's Secretary of the Interior, Albert B. Fall, was connected to the crime and made Harding's presidency again associated with corruption. Albert Fall convinced the Secretary of the Navy to transfer valuable properties of the oil reserves in Wyoming and California to the Interior Department. Fall ended up leasing the land to oil men after he took bribes of about $400,000. Fall was eventually found guilty of taking a bribe and did 1 year in jail. One of the third scandals associated with Harding's presidency involves his Attorney General, Charles Daughtry, Daugherty. Daughtry was accused by the Senate of the illegal sale of pardons and liquor permits in 1921. Daughtry was forced to resign and was never found guilty because after 2 trials, the jury still failed to agree. Harding ultimately died during office from pneumonia and deep vein thrombosis, and he was succeeded by Calvin Coolidge. Let's talk about Silent Cal. Silent Cal, or Calvin Coolidge, believed that government should be hands-off, so he did not call for the regulation of big business. A 3-way race for the White House in 1921. Republicans nominated conservative Calvin Coolidge as their candidate. Democrats nominated John Davis, and the Progressive Party nominated Robert La Follette from Wisconsin. Ultimately, you just need to know that Calvin Coolidge is going to win. He's the Republican candidate. Foreign policy flounderings and unraveling the debt knot. Bigger than foreign policy problems in the Dominican Republic, Haiti, and Mexico, the United States was dealing with international loans that needed to be repaid to the United States after World War I. Following the war, the United States was no longer a debtor state, D-E-B-T-O-R, meaning they no longer owed people, now people or countries owed them. The United States had loaned billions of dollars and sold tons of supplies to the Allies during World War I. By 1919, Europe owed the United States more than $10 billion. Reparations are only going to further complicate this problem and exacerbates Germany's debt problem. Britain realized that Germany would not be able to meet their reparation payments. And without the payments, Britain wouldn't be able to make their payments to the United States, so it was like a chain reaction. Please note that another reason the European powers aren't able to make their loan repayments was because of the high tariffs that America initiated after the war that basically made it impossible for them to sell their goods to America so they would have money for repayment. At the end of 1922, Germany asked for a delay on their reparation payments, and then they defaulted on some of the payments. So then the French sent in troops to pressure the Germans into paying. Germany decided that they were going to print more money to cover their reparations. Anytime you print more money, the only thing you're really going to do is add to the economic instability. And that's what Germany does. They print so much money that the money is now worthless, and it causes the most serious inflation that the world has ever known. In 1924, we get the Dawes Plan, D-A-W-E-S. With the Dawes Plan, Germany borrows money from New York banks to make its payments to France and Britain. Britain used the money to repay the United States. These payments briefly stimulated the economic recovery of European countries. The triumph of Herbert Hoover, 1928. Republican Herbert Hoover ran against Democrat Alfred Smith, and he won. This presidential campaign of 1928 was different because for the first time, radio factored into the presidential candidates' runs. Radio helps Hoover far more than it helps Alfred Smith. Hoover promoted individualism, self-help, free enterprise, and small government. He was against socialism, and he was against planned economies. President Hoover's first moves. Remember, Hoover is a guy that's all about individualism, self-help, free enterprise, and small government. So him being elected in this era in which we're seeing hard economic times, which are ultimately going to lead to a depression, is not going to bode well for the United States, because he isn't the president that's going to be able to respond with his ideas of individualism and self-help and free enterprise. He's not a man of the people. He's all about individualism and pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. So Hoover emphasis on self-help is going to lead to him initiating or asking Congress to pass the Hawley-Smoot tariff. Hawlesmoot tariff. The Hawley-Smoot tariff starts as a measure designed to protect farmers, but ends up being the highest protective tariff in U.S. peacetime history. The average tax on non-free goods went from 38.5% to 60%. And this angers foreigners because it seems like the United States is declaring economic war on the rest of the world. The Hawley-Smoot tariff is going to move away from reasonable taxes or reasonable tariffs and further increases the trade gaps. As it increases the trade gaps, it's going to lead to a deeper depression and push the United States further and further into economic isolation. The Great Crash ends the Golden 20s. The Great Crash, October 29th, 1929, is known as Black Tuesday. Black Tuesday is the day that the New York stock market crashes. It served as the trigger that helped propel the world into the Great Depression. The nation was plagued with joblessness, suicide rates skyrocketed, bread lines and soup kitchens became some people's only hope for survival. Even reproduction rates are affected. Banks collapse. People lost their savings. Remember, there's no FDIC. There's no Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation prior to the Great Depression. People covered up with what are called Hoover blankets. Hoover blankets are basically old newspapers, and the people slept in Hoovervilles, which are like cardboard boxes. So Hoovervilles become known as they're shanty towns, where extremely poor people lived during the Great Depression. They slept under newspapers in makeshift tents, and their visibility definitely tarnished the reputation of the Hoover administration. So finally, because things are so bad, Hoover has to give up his original platform of hands-off government. Remember, he was all about free enterprise, individualism, self-help. He's going to have to give up this original platform of hands-off government and provide some measure of social welfare to the people in order to help them deal with the Great Depression. Remember, Hoover does not believe that the federal government should help the people. He doesn't believe that the federal government should be responsible for alleviating individual suffering. He believed that the people should support the government, not the government should support the people. So he works to help struggling railroads, banks, rural credit corporations in hopes that if he helps businesses at the top, then that would alleviate some of the unemployment at the bottom. The thing about this trickle-down effect is that with trickle-down economics, there's never going to be enough trickle to reach the bottom. So he's really essentially only helping railroads, banks, and those credit corporations. It's not trickling down to alleviate the unemployment of the masses of poor people that are going through the Great Depression. Hoover battles the Great Depression. Hoover calls for Congress to reserve $2.25 billion for useful public works. One of the projects was the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River. It created a huge man-made lake for irrigation, flood control, and electric power. Hoover calls for Congress to provide relief, and that was met with the establishment of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was a government lending agency created to help with insurance companies, banks, railroads, and local governments. Again, it is not designed to help individuals. It is, however, going to pave the way for New Deal programs that are going to provide some relief to the people. The RFC, the Reconstruction Finance companies, are basically significant because they show Republicans like that hands-off government that wasn't going to be enough to deal with the problems associated with the Great Depression. Government is definitely going to have to step in. Routing the bonus army in Washington. Many veterans were amongst the hardest hit victims of the Depression, and they started calling for immediate payment of that 1924 Adjusted Compensation Act. Remember, at the beginning of this chapter, we said that the Adjusted Compensation Act was basically the vets calling for money that they lost, that they would have earned had they been working when they were away fighting the war for the United States. So, Great Depression hits, we have veterans calling for immediate payment of that Adjusted Compensation Act bonus. It should have been paid in 20 years, but they need it now. So the veterans are calling for immediate payment, and about 20,000 of them descend on Washington, D.C., and they set up these highly visible, unsanitary shantytown Hoovervilles. Congress does not pass the bonus bill, but Hoover says, okay, this is unsightly, this is making the administration look bad. I'll pay for the return fare of 60,000 of the vets. Remember, 20,000 showed up, but he'll pay for the return bus fare for 6,000, and he ordered the rest to disband or leave the camp. Riots broke out, and Hoover orders General Douglas MacArthur and the Army to remove these protesting vets. These are the same people who fought on behalf of the United States in World War I. He orders the Army to remove the protesting veterans. They use bayonets and they use tear gas. Because of this act, Hoover is depicted as a brute because he attacked the veterans. And this led to Democratic Franklin D. Roosevelt being elected in that next presidential election of 1928. Japanese militarists attacked China. Let's talk about the Mukden Incident, M-U-K-D-E-N. The Mukden Incident. Manchuria had originally been a Chinese possession. In 1921, Japan's military forces started a campaign to expand into Manchuria. They wanted Manchuria for economic interest, especially since they built and maintained the Manchurian Railroad. In September of 1931, Japanese troops used explosives to destroy a few feet of railroad in the north, like north of Mukden. But they basically accused the Chinese of trying to attack their railroads. Please understand that the Japanese blowing up a few feet of their own railroad was essentially just them being able to accuse the Chinese of doing it so they would have an excuse to attack the Chinese. So the Mukden Incident is going to lead to war between Japanese and Chinese troops. By 1932, Japan controlled all of Manchuria. As a result of the invasion of Manchuria, Chiang Kai-shek, C-H-I-A-N-G, new word, K-A-I-S-H-E-K. Chiang Kai-shek was a Chinese nationalist. He goes to the League of Nations and he asks them to please stop Japanese aggression. This is one of the first times that we're going to see the inefficiency of this peacekeeping organization that was established by President Woodrow Wilson at the end of World War I. Remember, it was designed to maintain peace. So the League of Nations tells Japan to withdraw their forces and restore Chinese rules. However, the Japanese respond by leaving the League of Nations. This is one of the first instances headed into World War II where it shows us the ineffectiveness of the League because they don't have the power backing of the United States. Remember, the United States failed to join the League of Nations, even though it was Wilson's idea created in his 14 points. United States fails to join, so it means the League of Nations is not going to have any teeth. The Mukden Incident represents the start of World War II. So normally when we think about World War II, we think about it starting in Europe with Hitler's invasion of Poland. That's not the official start of World War II. The official start of World War II begins in China, or deals with China and Japan with the Mukden Incident. The European start of World War II is Hitler's invasion of Poland. Hoover and the beginning of the Good Neighbor policy. So the Good Neighbor policy is definitely another one of those hands-off examples that we see from Herbert Hoover. And it represents a move away from the Roosevelt Corollary. The Roosevelt Corollary said that the United States would have the right to intervene in Latin American affairs if they felt the need to restore military or financial order. That was an interventionist policy. The Good Neighbor policy stresses that the United States becomes good neighbors and stay out of Latin American affairs. It is definitely a non-intervention policy. So good neighbor policy was started by Hoover, but it's perhaps most often associated with FDR or Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And again, that idea of good neighbors basically just means good neighbors mind their own business. Good neighbors are not in the affairs. They mind their own business. So it is definitely a non-interventionist policy. This has been chapter 30. Remember that listening to a podcast is not a substitute for actually reading the chapters. Have a great day.